Well under his tenure, as reflected in the strong GDP, productivity, and jobs numbers last week. But with his tweets threatening new tariffs on goods with China, he seems to be risking some of that growth potentially. Welcome now the president of Club for Growth, David McIntosh, joining us today from Washington. So David, welcome back. Good to have you here.
Great to be with you.
I know you've been very pleased with a lot of what the president's done, particularly with respect to deregulation and with respect to tax cuts. But how do we feel about this new threat of tariffs?
And you're right. We think the strong economy is a result of those policies on deregulation and tax cuts. So the tariffs, I think we need to look at this in two ways. The first, which was my first reaction yesterday, they're a tax on Americans. They're a drag on the economy. They're probably what's keeping us below 4% GDP growth. And if it's in fact implemented as policy, will have very negative consequences. We're seeing that in the market today. Then I stepped back and I said, there's a second way to look at this, and that's remembering the book that Donald Trump wrote before he was president, The Art of the Deal. This may be his effort to set out for the Chinese at the closing days, here are the negative consequences if we don't reach a deal. I'm ready to put these tariffs into place. But if that leads to a constructive deal where both sides pull back and reduce the tariffs, then it could be a win-win for both economies. We'll have to wait and see. It's a dangerous game because the Chinese may not understand that about Donald Trump. They may react by pulling back, saying, essentially having lost faith. My hope is that they've done their homework. They're very smart individuals leading their negotiation, and they realize how President Trump operates in a negotiation.
So I wonder how growth, both in China and the United States, might affect this negotiation in this sense. Does the president feel, as would be rational, you know what, we've got the economy growing pretty well, I have a stronger hand, this is exactly the time to push. Even if I take a little bit of a hit in the interim period, that's an investment against the future. Similarly, President Xi is looking at his economy saying it's not looking so bad either. Is it actually encouraging these two world leaders to be tougher with one another?
I have heard the president articulate that hang with me on these tariffs. We've got a strong economy now, and this will pay off in the long run. I think President Xi's got to look at the general effect the tariffs have had on his economic growth, where it did a reset lower for them. Hopefully, and this is where the charming part of President Trump's approach may play into it, that he can share with him, look, we can both gain in the long run with this. You can return to the very strong economic growth you have had. We'll have what the president calls a fair, more fair trade environment, and both sides could win. But it's going to be a dance back and forth where each side's going to lay out, if you don't agree with me, here's the negative consequence that ensue from that. I think China is pretty much at the end of the rope in terms of tariff plays, but they could always, basically because the government owns and controls much of the industry there, they could put more trade barriers that are non-tariff barriers in place in retaliation.
So David, go to the politics as a bit, and who's with the president, who's not necessarily with the president. On the one hand, the Chinese came out with a response. Their foreign ministry, their spokesperson came out with a response that essentially said, you know, we've heard this before, we're used to this, we can move on, it's not going to really impede our going forward as a practical matter. He said, as to the U.S. threat on the tariff increase of Chinese goods, I think that situation appeared many times before. So that's the Chinese response. But it struck me as ironic that the immediate support he got was from Chuck Schumer, the minority leader on the Democrat side up in the Senate, because Chuck Schumer wrote, hang tough on China, President Trump, don't back down. Are the Democrats more with the president on this strategy than the Republicans right now?
I don't think so at their core. I've always said it's a little bit dangerous to take advice from somebody who wants to kill you. Essentially, Chuck Schumer would like to see President Trump defeated, and the only way that can be guaranteed is if the economy tanks. So I would be a little leery of advice from someone who may want to see a dip in the economy to gain a political gain a year from now in the elections. Interestingly, on the Republican side, you do see a split there where the base of the party supports the president on the tariffs, but a lot of the more conservative members who also support him realize that it's dangerous for our economy and could hurt the economic growth that the Republicans are depending on in order to not repeat the disaster of the midterm elections.
So let's go forward to the next presidential election for a moment and talk about what role you see Club for Growth is potentially playing in that election. I mean, you were, as I said, a supporter of the president on tax cuts, supporter on deregulation. As you look at the issues going into 2020, where will Club for Growth really pick their spots?
Yes, what we're going to look at is continued efforts on those economic issues. Double down on the regulatory relief. There's opportunities for the administration to do that. We're also looking at creating a true free market in health care and appreciate the president putting that back on the table when congressional Republicans ducked after the Obamacare repeal failed. And then one issue that, frankly, the Hill Republicans are not very good on is spending. There's going to be a big battle on lifting the spending caps, where Republicans who are defense hawks are going to team up with the Democrats and say, if you let me spend my money, I'll let you spend your money. And in the end, they're spending the American money in the future. That may not have a negative economic impact right away, but it puts a large overhang, and actually in the end, I think, ends up creating more leverage for the Chinese when you step back and think about it, since they're the biggest owner of that debt. Those are the issues we're going to focus on. The ones that I think that will make the biggest difference in the election is, how is the economy doing? Do people feel secure that they're not going to lose their job? Their children will get a job when they graduate from college? That's probably the one way that Trump can overcome the feeling among suburban, well-educated moderates who frankly don't like his approach to politics. But if they think their family's going to be better off, then they won't go for fairly radical Democrat alternative.
Do you see any Democratic candidates who might appeal to you on some of those issues, who might be saying things that make sense to you?
Most of them are way off target. You know, they have put forward these aggressive Medicare for all, the government takeover of health insurance. They've put forward huge taxes, particularly the tax on unrealized gains, that are very dangerous for our economy and the growth in the economy. There is one area that there is an interesting combination of free market conservatives and progressives, and that's on a bill, well, it's actually on an issue that's going to come up in the nominations this week in the Senate, and it's exemplified by the XM Bank. We oppose that because we think it's crony capitalism. The progressives like Bernie Sanders oppose it because they think it's a corporate bailout. The honest best economic result may not be the best thing for Boeing, who uses it, but the best economic result across the board is let the marketplace provide that financing and defund the XM Bank.
And finally, David, the president's had a little bit of difficulty, I think it's fair to say, in getting nominees through for the Federal Reserve. As you look at that, are there particular candidates you favor? Or maybe as important, when it came to the Supreme Court, the president early on as a candidate put out a list of people who thought would be good candidates for the Supreme Court of the United States. Could you help the president, could you help the administration, the Club for Growth, and develop that kind of list for the Fed?
We would be delighted to. I can't say I've developed one now for you, David, but I was thinking about exactly that when Steve Moore withdrew his name after Herman Cain, that same approach the president used on the Supreme Court of finding people who agree with his economic approach but have the academic credentials that are unassailable. And there are people out there in academia, they don't subscribe to the sort of mainstream Keynesian approach at the Fed, but they are intelligent enough, you know, almost the way Milton Friedman was in his day. Who are the new young Milton Friedmans that have academic credentials that could be appointed to that? I can't give you the list, but I've made a note we need to develop one.
But it's a very interesting question. Okay, thank you so much, David, for being with us.
Yeah.
That's Club for Growth President David McIntosh coming to us from Washington.